After several days of asking to review my personal records, I was finally given permission to take home copies of the documents that belonged to me. The administrative assistant placed everything inside a worn cardboard storage box. "It's mostly older paperwork," she said with an apologetic smile. "Some of it came with your original admission file, and some was transferred from documents your family provided." I thanked her and carried the box back to my room. It wasn't especially heavy. Just years of ordinary life packed into faded folders. Medical forms. Insurance papers. Prescription records. Letters. Receipts. The sort of paperwork every family collects without thinking much about it. I had only one purpose that afternoon. I wanted to find a few medical documents. Nothing more. I planned to compare them with the notes I had already placed in my binder. If there were mistakes, I wanted to understand when they had first appeared. I made myself a cup of tea, pulled the box onto my desk, and began sorting through it one folder at a time. Dust rose into the afternoon sunlight as I opened the first file. The papers smelled faintly of old cardboard and aging ink. Some documents dated back more than a decade. Others were so familiar that I remembered exactly where Thomas and I had signed them together. It felt strangely comforting. For years, Thomas and I had handled every important document side by side. Taxes. Insurance. Property records. Neither of us liked surprises when it came to paperwork. "If it's important," he always said, "it belongs in writing." At the time, I thought he was simply organized. Now I realized he had been protecting us in ways I never fully appreciated. One folder led to another. Most of what I found was exactly what I expected. Nothing remarkable. Nothing mysterious. Just the quiet record of an ordinary life. Then, near the bottom of the box, I noticed something different. It wasn't inside a folder. It lay beneath a stack of outdated insurance statements, almost as though someone had tucked it away and forgotten it. It was a large yellow envelope. The paper had darkened with age, and one corner had begun to split where the glue had dried out over the years. For reasons I couldn't explain, my heart began beating faster before I even touched it. I slid it carefully from beneath the pile. Across the front, written in the unmistakable handwriting I had known for more than 40 years, were 6 simple words. "Copy of my will, keep for Margaret." I stopped breathing for a moment. I didn't need to see the signature. I knew that handwriting better than my own. Thomas. My fingers trembled as I traced the faded ink. A flood of memories returned all at once. The evenings when he sat at his desk balancing checkbooks. The weekends we organized file cabinets together. The way he insisted on making duplicate copies of every important legal document. "One copy is an accident waiting to happen," he used to joke. "We always keep a backup." I had smiled every time he said it. Apparently he had meant it. I stared at the envelope for several long seconds without opening it. Because another memory had suddenly pushed its way to the surface. The week after Thomas's funeral, Daniel and I had sat together at my dining room table. Both of us exhausted. Both of us trying to understand what life looked like without the man who had held our family together for so many years. I remembered asking him whether there had been a will. He had looked me in the eyes and answered without hesitation. "Dad didn't really leave anything behind except the house." I remembered asking again. "So there wasn't anything else?" He shook his head. "No, Mom. He kept things simple. He wanted everything to go to the family home." At the time, I believed him. Why wouldn't I? He was my son. He had just buried his father. The thought that he might be mistaken never crossed my mind. The thought that he might not be telling me everything never crossed it either. Slowly, I turned the envelope over. The seal had already been broken years ago. Someone had opened it. Whether that someone had been Thomas, an attorney, Daniel, or someone else entirely, I couldn't yet know. I slipped one finger beneath the flap and carefully eased out the papers inside. Several neatly folded legal documents rested within. The first page bore a title that instantly made my pulse quicken. Last will and testament. I closed my eyes. For years I had believed there was nothing more to discover after Thomas died. First, I learned about the lake house. Then I learned how easily people had accepted stories that were never true. Now, sitting alone at my desk with a yellow envelope in my hands, I found myself facing another question I had never expected to ask. If my husband had prepared a copy of his will specifically for me, why had I never seen it? And why had Daniel told me there was nothing to inherit except the home we had shared? I took a slow breath, unfolded the first page, and began to read. Somewhere inside those papers, I suspected, was another truth that had been waiting patiently for years. And if Thomas had written it down in his own hand, then no amount of retelling could change what the ink had already recorded. Grief has a way of making time disappear. People often ask what the days after losing a husband are like. I never know how to answer. Some memories remain painfully clear. Others vanish completely. I remember the flowers. I remember the casseroles neighbors brought to my house. I remember standing beside Thomas's casket, shaking hands with people whose faces I can no longer recall. But the days immediately after the funeral exist in my mind like pages blurred by rain. I wasn't thinking about legal documents. I wasn't thinking about property. I certainly wasn't thinking about inheritance. I was trying to learn how to wake up in a house that no longer contained my husband's footsteps. For 42 years, every morning had begun the same way. Thomas woke before I did. He made coffee. He opened the kitchen curtains. Sometimes he whistled while reading the newspaper. The morning after the funeral, the house was silent. That silence was louder than anything I had ever heard. During those first weeks, I moved through each day almost automatically. Friends stopped by. Church members checked on me. Neighbors offered to mow the lawn. Everyone wanted to help. I appreciated every act of kindness. But I barely remember any of it. There were simply too many decisions to make while my heart was still trying to understand what had happened. Thankfully, Daniel stepped in. Or at least, that was how I saw it then. He handled phone calls. He spoke with insurance companies. He organized paperwork. Whenever someone needed information, they usually called him instead of me. At the time, I felt relieved. I remember telling one of my friends, "I don't know what I'd do without Daniel." And I meant every word. He wasn't simply my son. He became the person I leaned on when I could barely think clearly. One afternoon, about a week after the funeral, Daniel came over carrying a folder. We sat together at the dining room table where Thomas and I had shared thousands of meals. The house still smelled faintly of the lilies people had sent after the service. Neither of us spoke for a while. Finally, I asked the question that had been quietly sitting in the back of my mind. "Did your father leave a will?" Daniel looked at me for only a moment before answering. "He didn't really leave any separate property, Mom." His voice sounded calm. Matter of fact. "There isn't much to worry about." I nodded slowly. "I wasn't worried. I just wasn't sure if there was paperwork." He opened the folder and glanced at a few papers. "Everything important has already been taken care of." I remember feeling grateful. Those words lifted a burden I hadn't even realized I was carrying. "So there's nothing I need to do?" He shook his head. "No. Dad kept things simple. Everything has already been handled." I looked down at my hands. "What about any personal property?" He smiled gently. "There really isn't anything separate. The house is what matters. And you're already living here." He reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You don't need to think about legal documents right now. You need time to grieve." At the time, those words felt comforting. Looking back now, I understand why I believed them without hesitation. Not because I was careless. Because I trusted the person saying them. Daniel had never given me a reason to question him. He was my only child. The boy I had watched take his first steps across our living room floor. The teenager who still hugged me before leaving for school. The young man who cried beside me at his father's funeral. Why would I imagine he wasn't telling me the whole truth? I never asked to see a copy of the will. I never contacted an attorney. I never requested probate records. Not because I didn't care. Because I believed there was nothing left for me to review. Whenever a form needed my signature, Daniel explained it. Whenever a letter arrived, he told me whether it required my attention. Sometimes he even opened the envelopes before bringing them into the kitchen. I thought he was helping. Perhaps he believed he was. At least then. Months passed. Then years. Life slowly found a new rhythm. I learned how to grocery shop for one person. I learned how to sleep on only one side of the bed. I learned how to celebrate birthdays with an empty chair at the table. What I never learned was that there had been questions I should have asked. Not because I distrusted my son. Because grief makes trust feel easier than investigation. There is something people rarely talk about after a funeral. The person who is grieving often hands responsibility to someone they love. Not forever. Just until they can breathe again. I handed mine to Daniel. Without hesitation. Without conditions. Without imagining that one day I would look back on those quiet conversations and wonder how much had been left unsaid. Now, years later, as I held the yellow envelope with Thomas's handwriting across the front, those memories returned with painful clarity. I realized I had not spent years believing a lie because I was naive. I had believed it because it came from the one person I trusted most. That realization hurt far more than discovering the envelope itself. The missing will was not the deepest wound. The deepest wound was understanding that I had never asked to see it because, in all those years, it had never crossed my mind that my own son might be keeping part of the truth from me. For several minutes, I simply held the envelope in my hands. The paper had grown brittle with age. The corners were worn. The flap had already been opened years before, though I still had no idea by whom. I ran my fingers over Thomas's handwriting one more time. Copy of my will, keep for Margaret. He had written those words himself. Not a lawyer. Not a secretary. Thomas. He wanted this copy to reach me. Somehow, it never had. I took a slow breath and carefully unfolded the documents inside. The first page was exactly what I expected. Last Will and Testament of Thomas Anderson. Below the title were the date, his signature, and the signatures of 2 witnesses. A notary's seal appeared at the bottom of the page. This wasn't a rough draft. It wasn't handwritten notes, or unfinished plans. It was a properly executed legal document. Official. Complete. Real. For a moment, I couldn't bring myself to keep reading. I remembered sitting beside Thomas years earlier when we discussed updating our estate plans. He had smiled and said, "If anything ever happens to me, I don't want you worrying about paperwork." I laughed at the time. "I'll probably make a mess of it." "No," he replied. "I'll make sure everything is clear." Those words echoed through my mind as I turned the next page. The document began with the usual legal language. Thomas declared that he was of sound mind. He revoked all previous wills. He appointed an attorney to oversee the administration of his estate. Nothing seemed unusual. Then I reached the section describing the distribution of his property. I read the first paragraph once. Then again. Then a third time. My husband had written that the majority of his estate was to pass directly to me. Not temporarily. Not in trust. Not through someone else. To me. The language was clear. There was no room for misunderstanding. I continued reading. Several investment accounts were specifically listed. Each one contained instructions stating that they could only be transferred, sold, or reassigned with my written authorization. Written authorization. Those 2 words seemed to glow on the page. Thomas hadn't left those decisions to chance. He wanted me to remain in control. Another page described additional financial accounts and property interests. Again, the language was unmistakable. Any significant transfer required my written consent. Thomas had anticipated that important decisions might arise after his death. He wanted those decisions to belong to me, not to anyone else. As I reached the next section, my heart began beating faster. The heading referred to a property I had only recently learned existed. The Lake House. I read every word carefully. Thomas explained that he had purchased the small home by the lake as a personal gift for me. His intention had been to surprise me on our 45th wedding anniversary. He wrote about retirement. About quiet summers together. About mornings on the porch overlooking the water. He hoped we would spend every June, July, and August thereafter he stepped away from work. A tear slipped onto the page before I could wipe it away. Even now, years after his death, I could still hear his voice. Thomas never cared much for expensive things. He cared about moments. A cup of coffee at sunrise. Fishing from an old wooden dock. Watching the evening light dance across the water. That little house had never been an investment. It had been a promise. One he never had the chance to keep. I turned another page. This time, I found Daniel's name. For just a moment, I stopped reading. I wanted to prepare myself. Then I continued. Thomas had not forgotten our son. Far from it. The will explained that Daniel would receive the remainder of the estate after my death, or sooner if I chose to distribute portions of it during my lifetime. Thomas trusted me to decide what was best. He believed I would always take care of our son. And he believed Daniel would understand that. There was no language suggesting Daniel should immediately control the estate. No instruction placing him in charge of my financial decisions. No statement saying everything automatically became his responsibility. Instead, Thomas had done something remarkably simple. He had placed his trust in me. I lowered the papers into my lap and stared out the window. The afternoon sunlight had begun to fade across the courtyard outside. Residents walked slowly along the garden path, unaware that my entire understanding of the past had just shifted. I picked up the will again and started from the beginning. This time I read every page more slowly. Every sentence. Every signature. Every date. I wanted to be certain I wasn't misunderstanding anything. I wasn't. The language remained the same no matter how many times I read it. Clear. Direct. Impossible to confuse. Yet it stood in complete opposition to everything Daniel had told me after Thomas died. He had said there was no separate property. Thomas had listed multiple assets. He had said everything had already been taken care of. The will required my written approval for important decisions. He had said there was nothing more for me to do. Thomas had specifically placed responsibility in my hands. I closed the document carefully and returned it to the yellow envelope. For a long time, I simply sat there. I wasn't angry. Not yet. I was trying to understand how two completely different versions of the same story could exist. One had been spoken across my dining room table years ago. The other had been written, signed, witnessed, and notarized long before that conversation ever took place. One depended entirely on memory. The other rested quietly on paper, unchanged by time. In that moment, I finally understood something Thomas had told me countless times during our marriage. People may remember conversations differently, he used to say. But a properly written document remembers exactly what it says. As I held his will in my hands, I realized he had been right. The truth had been waiting patiently for years. It hadn't disappeared. It had simply been buried beneath a story I had trusted because it came from my own son. After reading Thomas's will, I knew I could not put the envelope away and pretend I had misunderstood. The words were too clear. The signatures were too real. The dates were too specific. So I did what I had learned to do. I gathered every document I had. The yellow envelope. The property tax receipts. The lake house photographs. The emails. The admission papers from the retirement community. The copies Daniel had given me after Thomas died. The records I had recently requested. One by one, I spread them across my desk. At first, the table looked like a mess. But I wasn't looking for order yet. I was looking for patterns. The first thing I noticed was missing paperwork. There were documents I remembered seeing years ago. Insurance letters. Bank summaries. A property statement Thomas once kept in the filing cabinet. They were not in the box. They were not in my binder. They were not among the papers Daniel had returned to me. I searched twice. Then a third time. They were gone. The second thing I noticed was just as troubling. Some files existed only as photocopies. No originals. No envelopes. No attached letters explaining where they had come from. One investment statement had been copied so poorly that part of the account number was cut off. Another document had a signature page, but the pages before it appeared to be missing. Individually, those things might have meant nothing. Old paperwork gets misplaced. Copies are made. Families lose track of records after a death. I knew that. I wanted to believe that. Then I looked at the dates. That was when the quiet worry in my chest became something sharper. One document listed a transfer date that did not match the date on the attached tax form. Another referred to a property review completed before I had supposedly agreed to any discussion about selling. A third mentioned an account closing during the same month Daniel had told me there was. Nothing left to handle. Nothing left to handle. I remembered his voice saying it. Calm. Certain. Comforting. Now those words felt very different. I took out a blank sheet of paper and wrote 3 columns. Document. Date. Question. Then I began listing everything. Not accusations. Not conclusions. Just questions. Why was the original will not given to me? Why had I only found this copy now? Where were the original investment documents? Why were some pages missing? Who requested copies? Who had access to Thomas's files after he died? Why had Daniel never mentioned the assets named in the will? That last question stayed with me the longest. Because the will did not describe vague possibilities. It named specific accounts, specific property interests, specific instructions. Some of those assets had never once been mentioned to me. Not by Daniel. Not by Vanessa. Not by anyone. For years I had believed there was nothing to ask about because Daniel told me there was. Nothing there. But the will said otherwise. I pulled out the folder Daniel had handed me after Thomas's funeral. It was thin. Too thin, I realized now. Inside were only a few basic papers. A death certificate copy. A utility bill. A homeowner's insurance notice. A short note about the family home. At the time, I had accepted it as complete. Now it looked less like an estate file and more like a carefully selected sample. That thought frightened me. I did not want to believe my son had hidden legal documents from me. I did not want to believe anyone had removed papers from Thomas's files. But I could no longer ignore what sat in front of me. The documents did not line up. The story did not line up. The dates did not line up. I placed the will beside Daniel's old folder. The contrast was impossible to miss. Thomas's document gave me rights, choices, and authority. Daniel's explanation had given me silence. I sat back and stared at the desk. One missing document could be an accident. One photocopy could be convenience. One wrong date could be a clerical mistake. One forgotten asset could be poor memory. But all of them together? That was harder to explain. When several small details lean in the same direction, they are no longer small. They become a pattern. And the pattern in front of me was deeply troubling. Someone had known more than I was told. Someone had controlled which papers reached me. Someone had allowed me to believe Thomas left almost nothing behind, even though his own will said the opposite. I picked up my blue notebook and opened to a clean page. At the top, I wrote, missing and inconsistent documents, then I recorded everything. Every missing original. Every incomplete copy. Every conflicting date. Every asset listed in the will that had never been explained to me. My hand was steady as I wrote. That surprised me. Perhaps I had passed the point of shock. Perhaps part of me had been preparing for this since the day Daniel first mentioned the lake house. When I finished, I placed the notebook beside the yellow envelope. The room was quiet. Outside, the evening light had begun to fade. I looked at Thomas's handwriting one more time. Keep for Margaret. He had tried to make sure the truth would reach me. Somehow, it had taken years. And now that I had it, I could not pretend the rest of the papers did not matter. Each missing page was a question. Each wrong date was a warning. Each unexplained asset was a door I had not yet opened. And for the first time, I understood that my husband's will had not simply revealed what he left behind. It had revealed how much had been kept from me. I didn't call Daniel immediately after finding the will. For nearly 2 days I carried the yellow envelope with me from the desk to the bedside table and back again. I read the document several more times. Not because I hoped the words would change. Because I wanted to make sure my emotions weren't changing them for me. They didn't. Every sentence said exactly what it had said the first time. Every page carried the same signatures. Every instruction remained perfectly clear. Finally, on Thursday afternoon, I picked up my phone. I wasn't calling to accuse him. I wasn't looking for an argument. I wanted to ask one simple question. I dialed his number. He answered after the third ring. "Hi, Mom." "Hello, sweetheart." His voice sounded relaxed. Almost cheerful. "Everything okay? I found something while organizing some old papers." "Oh? A copy of your father's will." The silence lasted only a second. But I noticed it. "You found the will?" "Yes." "I didn't realize you still had a copy." "Neither had I. I've been reading it." Another brief pause. Then Daniel said something that immediately caught my attention. "I thought you already knew everything that was in it." I looked down at the document resting on my lap. "If I had known everything, I wouldn't be calling." He laughed softly. Not nervously. More like someone trying to make the conversation feel lighter. "What did you want to ask?" I chose my words carefully. "Why did you tell me your father didn't really leave any separate property?" "I don't remember saying exactly that. You said there wasn't much besides the house." He hesitated. "I guess that's how I understood it." I waited. "I remember the attorney explaining that most of the assets weren't really worth much anymore." I wrote the sentence in my notebook as he spoke. Not because I doubted my memory. Because I had learned that exact wording matters. Weren't worth much? That's what I remember. I glanced back at the will. It listed investment accounts, real estate, specific instructions requiring my written approval. Nothing about the language suggested those assets were meaningless. "Which attorney told you that?" Daniel hesitated again. "I'm not sure. It was a long time ago." "You don't remember his name?" "No." "What meeting are you talking about?" "The meeting after Dad passed away. I remember sitting with the lawyer." His answer came quickly, almost automatically. Then he added another sentence. "Vanessa was there too." I stopped writing. "She was?" "Yes." I think she asked more questions than I did. I let that sentence settle between us. "What questions?" "I don't remember exactly. It was mostly about the estate." The lawyer explained everything. I noticed something strange. Every answer Daniel gave was vague. Not one referred to a specific page. Not one referred to a specific clause. He remembered conclusions. He didn't remember details. I asked another question. "Did the attorney ever say I needed to approve transfers in writing?" Silence. "I don't remember." "Do you remember the section about the lake house?" No. "What about the investment accounts listed in the will?" "I honestly don't know." His voice sounded sincere. Not defensive. Simply uncertain. I closed my eyes for a moment. Then I asked the question that mattered most. "Daniel." "Yes?" "Did you ever read your father's will yourself?" The line became completely quiet. I could hear him breathing. A car passed somewhere in the background. Finally, he answered. I looked through it." "You looked through it?" "I didn't read every page." I said nothing. He continued speaking, almost as though he felt the need to explain himself. The attorney summarized everything. I trusted what he told us. Another pause. And Vanessa understood all the legal language much better than I did. There it was. Not an answer. An explanation. One I had heard in different forms before. Whenever I asked about details, Daniel rarely answered the question itself. Instead, he explained why he believed what he believed. I looked down at the will again. The words on the page had not summarized themselves. Someone had read them. Someone had interpreted them. Someone had explained them to Daniel. And he had accepted those explanations without comparing them to the document in front of him. I decided to try once more. The will says the lake house was a gift from me. I know. Did anyone ever explain that to me? I thought they had. Who? I don't know. I assumed. His voice faded. I just assumed you already knew. Another assumption. Another belief. Another answer without certainty. I realized something that made my heart ache. Daniel wasn't lying the way I had once imagined. He wasn't inventing stories on the spot. He was repeating conclusions that had settled into his mind years earlier. Conclusions he no longer questioned. Conclusions that felt like memories even though he couldn't explain where they had come from. We talked for a few more minutes. Mostly about ordinary things. Work. The weather. Whether I needed anything from the grocery store. When we finally said goodbye, neither of us mentioned the will again. I ended the call and placed my phone on the table beside the yellow envelope. Then I opened my notebook. Under today's date, I wrote only a few lines. Daniel remembers explanations. He does not remember the document itself. He believes what he was told. I rested my pen on the page. One question refused to leave my mind. It was a simple question. Perhaps the simplest one I had asked since this journey began. If my son had trusted other people's explanations for years, if he had never carefully read the very document that determined our family's future, then whose understanding had he been repeating all this time? And perhaps more importantly, had Daniel ever truly known what his father's will actually said? Or had he spent years believing someone else's version of it without ever reading the truth for himself? The following Monday, I drove to a small law office on the east side of town. The building looked almost exactly as I remembered it. Red brick. White shutters. A brass plaque beside the front door that had faded slightly with age. Thomas and I had walked through those doors more than once over the years. We updated our estate plan there. Signed insurance documents. Reviewed property records. Back then, those visits felt like ordinary responsibilities shared by two people building a life together. I never imagined I would one day return alone, carrying questions instead of plans. The receptionist greeted me with a warm smile. Good morning. How can we help you? My name is Margaret Anderson. I was hoping to speak with Mr. Harris if he's available. She looked up from her computer. One moment, please. A few minutes later, she returned. You're in luck. He has a little time this morning. I thanked her and followed her down a quiet hallway lined with framed certificates and photographs. When Richard Harris stood to greet me, I immediately recognized him. He had more gray hair than I remembered. His glasses were different. But his calm expression hadn't changed at all. Margaret. He smiled warmly as we shook hands. It's been far too long. It has. I'm sorry we haven't seen each other under happier circumstances. So am I. He invited me to sit. What brings you in today? Without saying a word, I placed the yellow envelope on his desk. I found this. He looked at Thomas's handwriting on the front of the envelope. For just a moment, his expression softened. I remember this file. You do? I do. He carefully removed the documents and began reading. The office became very quiet. Only the sound of turning pages broke the silence. I watched his face closely. He wasn't surprised by what he was reading. He wasn't confused. He simply took his time. When he reached the final page, he placed the document neatly back on his desk and folded his hands. This is an authentic copy. I felt myself release a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. You're certain? Yes. He nodded. The signatures are correct. The witness acknowledgments are consistent. The notarization appears exactly as I remember. He tapped the corner of the document gently. I don't see anything suggesting this copy has been altered. I looked down at the will. So this is real. It is. I hesitated before asking my next question. The contents haven't been changed? No. Not that I can see. This reflects the will your husband executed. His answer was calm. Matter of fact. Professional. Exactly what I needed. I gathered my courage. Mr. Harris. May I ask you something? Of course. When Thomas passed away, should I have received a copy? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he leaned back slightly in his chair, as though carefully considering how best to explain the process. Generally speaking, he said, when a client leaves a valid will, the appropriate parties are provided with the documents they are entitled to receive as part of the estate administration. He paused. In a situation like yours, it would have been entirely normal for you to have a copy of the will. I felt my fingers tighten around the edge of my handbag. So I wasn't mistaken. No. It would not have been unusual for you to keep your own copy. I glanced again at the envelope. Then why didn't I have it? The question remained between us for several seconds. Mr. Harris removed his glasses and placed them carefully on the desk. I wish I could answer that. You can't? I'm afraid I can't. He spoke gently. There are many reasons documents may not end up where they were intended. People move. Files are reorganized. Paperwork is misplaced. He chose each word carefully. I don't want to speculate. I appreciated his honesty. Speculation was exactly what I had been trying to avoid. I asked another question. Do you remember giving the file to Daniel? He thought for a moment. I honestly don't remember the details of the transfer. It was several years ago. I've handled many estates since then. I understand. He looked at me with quiet sympathy. What I can tell you is this. He rested one hand lightly on the will. This document appears complete. There is no obvious indication that it has been modified. I nodded slowly. Then I asked the question that mattered most. If I should have had this copy years ago, what do you think happened? Mr. Harris remained silent for a long moment. Finally, he answered in the only way he responsibly could. My best professional response is this. He looked directly at me. Something may have happened after the file left this office. Nothing more. Nothing less. He didn't accuse anyone. He didn't suggest wrongdoing. He didn't offer theories. Only that simple observation. Something may have happened after the file left this office. I repeated the sentence quietly to myself. It wasn't the answer I had hoped for. Yet somehow, it was enough. Because it confirmed one important fact. The mystery did not begin with the will itself. The mystery began somewhere after the paperwork was handed over. Mr. Harris returned the documents to the yellow envelope. I recommend you keep this somewhere safe. I will. If you locate any additional records, I'd be happy to review them with you. Thank you. As I stood to leave, he added one final thought. Margaret. Yes? Written documents often answer one question while creating several new ones. I smiled faintly. I've been discovering that. He walked me to the door and wished me well. The drive back to the retirement community was unusually quiet. The yellow envelope rested on the passenger seat beside me. I glanced at it more than once while waiting at traffic lights. The meeting had not revealed who was responsible. It had not proven that anyone intentionally hid the will. It had not answered every question that had been building in my mind. But it had done something just as important. It narrowed the search. The will was genuine. Its contents were unchanged. By ordinary practice, I should have had my own copy years ago. Somewhere between my husband's careful planning and the life I had been living ever since, something interrupted that process. I still didn't know what. I still didn't know who. But as I carried the yellow envelope back into my room that afternoon, I realized I was no longer searching for a missing document. I was searching for the missing part of its journey. And somehow, I felt certain that the answer was still waiting to be found. That evening, I didn't turn on the television. I didn't open the novel that had been sitting on my nightstand for nearly a week. Instead, I carried every folder, every notebook, and every document I had collected to the small table by the window. For the first time, I laid everything out at once. The yellow envelope containing Thomas's will rested in the center. Around it, I placed the other pieces. The photographs of the lake house. The old brass key. The property tax receipts. Copies of text messages. Emails. Medical paperwork. My blue notebook. The growing binder that now seemed heavier every time I picked it up. The table was almost too small. Some papers overlapped. Others hung over the edge. I stood quietly, looking down at them. Weeks earlier, I would have seen a collection of unrelated documents. Now I saw something different. I saw a timeline. I reached for my notebook and wrote 4 headings across a blank page. The lake house, the retirement community, the memory story, Thomas's will. Then I began writing beneath each one. The lake house. Thomas had secretly purchased it as an anniversary gift. I never knew it existed. After his death, it was sold. Most of the practical arrangements had been handled by Vanessa. Daniel knew very little about the details. Next, the retirement community. For months, conversations about leaving my home had become more frequent. Brochures appeared. Appointments were scheduled. Emails discussed plans before I had agreed to anything. Family members later believed I had chosen to move here. Then came the story about my memory. People began speaking to me differently. Relatives asked unusual questions. Staff members treated me as though cognitive decline had already been established. Yet no physician had ever diagnosed me with dementia. Finally, Thomas's will. A valid legal document. A copy prepared specifically for me. Instructions placing major decisions in my hands. Assets I had never been told about. A lake house intended as a gift. A document I should have received years ago. I set down my pen. Each page described a different chapter of my life. Yet as I looked from one column to the next, something quietly unsettled me. They no longer felt separate. One event seemed to lead naturally into the next. The disappearance of the lake house. The move away from my home. Questions about my memory. The hidden will. If I had looked at any one of those events by itself, I might have called it an unfortunate misunderstanding. A mistake. Bad communication. But all 4 together? That was much harder to dismiss. I wasn't looking for someone to blame. I had promised myself I would never force the facts to fit a conclusion. The facts had to lead the way. Still, one detail continued to draw my attention. I picked up another sheet of paper. At the top, I wrote only one word. Present. Then I began listing names. The lake house. Frank remembered Vanessa visiting the property several times. The retirement community. Vanessa found brochures. Scheduled visits. Spoke about moving. The story about my memory. Daniel said Vanessa had shown him information about early dementia. She had spoken with confidence about symptoms. The will. Daniel remembered Vanessa attending discussions after Thomas died. I looked at the page for a long time. I didn't write her name under every event. Because I couldn't honestly do that. There were conversations I hadn't witnessed. Meetings I hadn't attended. Documents I hadn't seen. I refused to fill those gaps with guesses. But I also couldn't ignore what was already there. Again and again, Vanessa appeared somewhere near the edges of each story. Not always at the center. Not always making decisions. Sometimes simply present. Sometimes explaining. Sometimes organizing. Sometimes speaking when others remained quiet. I leaned back in my chair. The room was completely silent. Outside my window, the courtyard lights reflected softly on the wet sidewalk after an evening rain. For the first time, I asked myself a question I had carefully avoided. What if I had been looking at these events one at a time because that was the easiest way to understand them? What if they had never been separate to begin with? I wasn't saying they were connected. Not yet. I didn't have enough evidence to say that honestly. But I could no longer pretend the possibility didn't exist. I thought about Richard Harris's words. Written documents often answer one question while creating several new ones. He had been right. Finding Thomas's will hadn't ended my search. It had widened it. I closed the yellow envelope and rested it beside the binder. Then I gathered the photographs into a neat stack. One by one, I returned every document to its proper place. Not because I was finished. Because I had learned that every piece mattered. Every receipt. Every email. Every note in my blue notebook. Every page had become part of a much larger picture. A picture I still couldn't fully see. Before turning out the light, I opened my notebook one last time. Under the day's date, I wrote a single sentence. These are no longer separate stories. They are becoming one. I closed the notebook and placed it beside my bed. I still didn't know what the final picture looked like. I didn't know why Thomas's will had never reached me. I didn't know how many more answers remained hidden inside old files and fading memories. And I certainly didn't know what anyone's ultimate intention had been. But I knew this much. Every trail I followed seemed to cross the same familiar path. Not always in the same place. Not always in the same way. Yet somehow, Vanessa's name kept appearing at the edges of each story. That wasn't proof of anything by itself. It was simply another fact I could not ignore. And for the first time since this journey began, I felt certain of one thing. I was finally following the right trail. That night, I sat alone beside the small safe in the corner of my room. The yellow envelope rested quietly in my hands. I had already read Thomas's will more times than I could count. Each time, I discovered something new. Not because the words had changed. Because I had. For years I had believed that everything important about my husband's life had ended the day we buried him. Now I understood that some of his final acts of love had simply been waiting for me to find them. I opened the envelope one last time. The pages were beginning to feel familiar beneath my fingertips. I turned slowly until I reached the final page. Beneath the legal language, beneath the signatures and the notary's seal, was a short handwritten note Thomas had added for me. It wasn't long. Just one sentence. If one day you read these words, remember that I always wanted you to be safe and treated with the respect you deserve. The room around me disappeared. For a long moment, I could almost hear his voice. Not the voice from the final months of his illness. The voice I remembered from years before. Calm. Steady. Certain. Thomas had always believed that love wasn't measured by promises. It was measured by the quiet things people did to protect one another. Keeping careful records. Planning ahead. Making sure I would never be left unprepared. Even after all these years, he was still trying to protect me. A tear rolled down my cheek and landed softly on the edge of the paper. This time, I didn't wipe it away. I let it remain there for a moment before carefully folding the will exactly as I had found it. The paper slid back into the yellow envelope. The envelope disappeared into the small fireproof safe beside my bed. I turned the lock slowly until I heard the soft click. For the first time since this journey had begun, I realized something had changed inside me. When I first discovered the truth about the lake house, I felt confused. When I learned about the stories people believed regarding my memory, I felt hurt. When I found the will, I felt betrayed. But sitting there that night, another feeling quietly took their place. Determination. Not anger. Not revenge. Determination. I no longer wanted to spend my days asking why these things had happened. I wanted to understand how they had happened. Every document I found answered one question and uncovered another. Every conversation revealed another missing piece. Every careful note in my blue notebook brought the picture into sharper focus. I wasn't collecting papers anymore. I was following a trail. And for the first time in years, I no longer saw myself only as someone things had happened to. I had become someone willing to search for the truth, no matter where it led. I switched off the lamp beside my bed. The room fell quiet. Outside, the wind rustled gently through the trees beyond my window. Tomorrow, I would continue asking questions. Tomorrow, I would keep reading every document. Tomorrow, I would follow the next clue. Because Thomas had left me more than an inheritance. He had left me a reason to keep going. And I intended to honor that gift, not by holding on to the past, but by making sure the truth was finally allowed to speak for itself.